For the first time in American history, the Supreme Court ruled that when the Second Amendment says there's a right to keep and bear arms, that means a right to carry a handgun outside the home for self-defense.
Don't be afraid of the dark. Be careful with stars. Not every light is gonna guide you, baby.
That's a news report that many of us heard yesterday, that the Supreme Court ruled that a New York law with strict guidance on where handguns are permitted is unconstitutional. 5 states with similar laws will now go the way of New York in seeking a different solution to the rise in gun crime. This is a reality that we've seen sweep across America recently, a rise in firearm incidents that are landing children and adults alike in hospitals and the back of police squad cars. This is a dark time where violence is pressed to the forefront with weapons, and society at large is overlooking a growing trend in acts of desperation. But there is a guiding light amid the shadows, and that's what we're here to talk about today on the Celebrate Kids podcast in our daily segment, Facing the Dark. Let's sit down with Dr. Kathy Cook and explore this topic. Dr. Kathy, a few weeks ago it was reported that a first grader brought a gun to school and shot his teacher at school. In addition to this, there's been a number of hospitals that have reported that childhood injuries and death due to firearms is rising at an alarming rate. There's one hospital in St. Louis that noted that there's a 52% rise in firearm-related incidents with children this last year. They highlighted that many of these were impacting children in poor neighborhoods. As a culture, what does it say about us when we see that there are children being impacted in this way by firearms?
What does it say about our culture? We have a sad culture. I think there's fear, despair, danger, a lack of respect for first responders, which is why I think a lot of people have decided to arm themselves. To make it, if you want to arm yourself, but keep the weapon, locked up in a proper place. Man, this makes me, again, so sad. What does it say about the culture? We're broken. We're not prioritizing children and common sense safety.
Oftentimes when we hear these stories, there's a natural tendency for us to kind of point to the firearms. And obviously in this story, it's a reality. They're a natural component inside of these statistics. But there's been also increases in other forms of violence. John Stonestreet often calls it kind of acts of desperation, that the culture is broken in such a way that we just kind of act out of desperation. And I've seen different things where there's been, fist fights at sporting events. There's been people on airplanes that have, lost their cool and have hurt other people. So we know that living inside of this society can be really stressful. And oftentimes that stress can be either modeled for children on how to handle it, or even sometimes, God forbid, we end up taking it out on children. What should we realize about kind of stress? And how can parents listening today really build some stress releases that are healthy, and healthy as a way to not only live, but also as a way to encourage and model for our kids?
I like that question. Thanks, because this is the solution again, to be stress reliever, stress releasers. Stress may come and go in our lives, and some people might be legitimately clinically diagnosed as being anxious and being depressed, which would cause, of course, a type of stress. So I appreciate you asking me about stress releases. What can kids do? Have fun with your children. Play board games, go to the park, swing on the swing set. No joke. Good days make bad days easier to handle. And when we know that there are good days around the corner, we don't get down in the slump and stay there if we've had a bad day. And speaking of bad days, by the way, nobody has a bad day. You have bad moments within a day. And that's just another stress release, is listen to your kids' language. Today was terrible. Was the whole day terrible? Well, lunch. Okay, then say lunch was terrible. Let's not overplay and over-exaggerate. So that's another stress release, is to listen to the language and correct their thought life. Have fun together. Go outside. Vitamin D and sunshine and physical exercise outside, at the park, in the garden, walking for a hike, going to the beach if you can. Those kinds of things matter greatly. And then what about families, grandparents, parents, and kids who create moments that become memories? If most of us listening look back on our childhood, it's not the big things. Some of the big things matter greatly. Some of the big things matter greatly. Let me say that again. Some of the big things matter greatly. but a lot of little things matter. Like one of my favorite memories as a kid, and my brother and 4 cousins would say the same thing, our grandparents had us over on Saturdays for homemade pancakes. I mean, back in the day, they were probably only homemade pancakes. They didn't have pancakes you could stick in a toaster. It's not a pancake if it comes out of a toaster. But, our grandmother and grandfather, they made these memories for us because they had moments with us. So let's look for that and let's talk about those things. Could I tell you a quick story? When I taught 2nd graders, I had in the corner of one of my rooms styrofoam peanuts. Do you remember those styrofoam peanuts? And there was this rule that if my kids were frustrated and discouraged or even angry, they were allowed at the appropriate time to go over to that corner and pick up a handful of styrofoam peanuts and throw them against the wall as hard as they could. And they would, pull their arm back and they would grimace and they would throw those styrofoam peanuts. And it was hysterical because they went nowhere. They went like a foot up and a foot out, and then they just, fluttered to the ground. And then, of course, the rule was you have to pick them up and put them away. But I did that because I wanted the kids to know that, being stressed and discouraged and even a bit angry, like that's going to happen throughout the day potentially, but it's what you do with it that matters greatly. And that's been a really fun discovery for me. So maybe that's even something moms and dads could do who are listening to us today.
I think there's a reality for many parents, and myself is included in this, that we do our best to manage our lives in such a way that we don't let stress get to us. But there's a reality that it does oftentimes. And in those moments, no matter kind of what situation you're in, I think sometimes your kids can kind of walk away teary-eyed. They didn't like the stress of a moment. Something was too intense. If you get lost inside of a big city and you're driving and it's a tense moment and your voice might be elevated or what have you, and kids can kind of get teary in those moments. And I wonder if you could give me some perspective as we kind of close here in terms of the role of stress in our lives to show some different things for us. But then also, when those moments do happen, how should we as adults respond? Maybe we've stepped over the line, or maybe there's nothing that we can really do. A situation is just so tense that it causes a child to have, despair. They might break down in tears, or they might act out in frustration, or different things of that nature. We're going to run into those moments in our lives, I think, no matter what. As adults, what can we do to help walk our kids through stressful times, knowing that they're going to kind of come and happen? How can we kind of guide our kids well there to manage that?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. Again, being attentive and knowing our role. Like, I'm proud of any parent and grandparent who recognizes that they played a part in their child's response or fear or tears or debate, arguing, and screaming. It doesn't excuse it. But let's not make the kids feel only responsible when we realize that we've played a part in their emotional response to how the world works. So pay attention to your own heart, pay attention to the environment you're creating, pay attention to your kids. Don't blame and shame. Listen, hug, laugh with them, cry with them, weep and rejoice, have conversations. One of the things I'd recommend is to write down reactions. We don't lie as often in writing as we do in our thought life. So if you and your kids are having a discussion about, well, Daddy, you said we were going to go to the park and you never follow through. Whoa, never? That's really unfair. And write down some things and talk about some things and make sure you're speaking truth over each other. And then I'm going to say, Wayne, what a lot of other people would say. Let's pay attention to our sleep patterns, our food, our use of technology, the friends we hang out with, the music we listen to, the shows we watch. A lot of young people today are being exposed to really negative examples, not just from a mom and a dad, because the culture is full of them. And if we recognize that we're following through as well, like we're listening to some shows or music and it's not good for our soul, we need to own that. We need to own that. Make sense?
Dr. Kathy has such great insight here. For many adults, we recognize that a lot of the lessons we give children are caught, not taught. That truth extends to adults too, though. That how we deal with stress and anger may be reflecting what's around us more than we'd like to believe. And that truth is something that finds its footing inside of Scripture. And today, we're turning to a prayer from David in the Psalms. It's one that David penned, noting the pressing of the culture around him. We're going to read from Psalms 101, verses 1 through 4. This is what David writes. I will sing of your love and justice. To you, Lord, I will sing praise. I will be careful to lead a blameless life. When will you come to me? I will conduct the affairs of my house with a blameless heart. I will not look with approval on anything that is vile. I hate what faithless people do. I will have no part in it. The perverse of heart shall be far from me. I will have nothing to do with what is evil. That declaration at the beginning of Psalms 101 is an important declaration that Dr. Kathy encourages us to make in our own homes, but also in our own personal lives. And we hope that Dr. Kathy's words and those words from David today are an encouragement to you. And if they are, would you share this podcast with your friends? Would you also do me a favor and leave a review on this podcast? We want to thank you for listening to this podcast. For Dr. Kathy Cook, my name is Wayne Stender, and we'll see you next week.